I think far-right and fascist groups have grown in popularity in the wake of events which have happened in the last year.
I certainly think they've grown in visibility. I'm not sure if there are actually more movements or more activists as a total number than, let's say, there were 20 years ago. But I certainly think that social media, the impact of Brexit and the emboldening of certain racist activists and groups, but also I think the willingness to demonstrate and to show themselves on the street is something that we've seen that's fundamentally different in 15 years before.
There's been a far-right demo in Teesside since January 2016. Why do you think far-right groups have been so quiet over the last year?
I think one of the things is a change in strategy, a move towards smaller places. So one of the things that we've seen in the Northeast, for example, far-right demonstrations in places like Boosbeck and Bishop's Auckland. And I think one reason, not just clearly the very passionate and engaged anti-fascist protests that they find, but when you have 80 activists, let's say, turning up in Newcastle or Teesside, that doesn't look like much of a success. You have 80 or 100 activists turning up in a small place like Bishop Auckland, that looks a lot bigger, and I think that that might have contributed to the change in strategy, moving away from bigger towns towards smaller places where the visibility seems to be greater.
June 2016, Labour MP Joe Cox was murdered by far-right terrorist Thomas Mayer. Do you think this will spark a fresh wave of far-right extremism?
Fortunately, it hasn't thus far, and one of the things that we see is not just far-right extremism, but it actually may have led to the limiting of far-right extremism. Some of the groups that came out very vocally in support of Thomas Mayer, the murderer and political assassin of Joe Cox, were first and foremost National Action. They were then done under Section 58, the glorification of terrorism rule, that allowed that movement to be banned. So in one sense, it's been a counter-extremism. One of the other things that sometimes happens with these self-directed individual assassins or terrorists is that they can spawn copycats. And that's also something I think we have to be thankful that we haven't seen in the 8 or 9 months or so since Joe Cox's just appalling murder.
Neo-Nazi groups such as National Action have started appearing in recent years. Why do you think there's been a resurgence in neo-Nazi groups?
I think social media has more to do with it than we like to think. A group like National Action, which only had 100 members maybe in its heyday before it was being banned, was notorious for many of its guerrilla actions and activism online. And I think that one of the things that we've seen is a dearth of digital literacy that allows any one of a number of really crazy memes to circulate online. I think that's very dangerous. So the unashamed neo-Nazism is part of that, even though it appeals to a tiny, tiny minority, let's say less than 1% in this country. In a country of 60 million people, obviously that could be several hundreds of thousands of people. That's very
The BNP have stood in by-elections lately. Do you think far-right parties, including UKIP, stand any chance of success in parliamentary elections?
Not so far. And remember, there's never been a far-right MP in this country. First-past-the-post system is something that really mitigates against smaller insurgent parties. But I think there's another thing to look at. Yes, we have the national picture where no one's been a far-right MP, and I would exclude UKIP from that as a far-right group. I think it's more of a fringe, reactionary right-wing group than far-right properly. But that's not to say, as you've pointed out, that groups aren't also standing in local elections and in regional elections. For example, in 2015, the National Front, I mean, who's heard from them in 20 years, actually stood 15 candidates between Newport and Swansea in South Wales. So there are local and even regional hotspots where the far right might choose to stand candidates, but as yet they're more at risk of losing their deposit than we are at risk of hosting them on a local or even national basis.
The far-right always exploit events such as the Westminster attacks. What can be done to stop their message of division and hatred?
Well, I think that's an important question to end on, because the far-right really has made use of so-called trigger attacks, both negative, like terrorist incidents, the appalling murder of drummer Lee Rigby, or the attack much more recently in Westminster. But they can also use trigger attacks that aren't violent. Experts to call that a kind of celebratory racism, quite the opposite of people presumably being angry and holding, in this case, Muslims to account for appalling murders by jihadi Islamist terrorists who pervert the doctrine of Islam. So in that sense, I do think that it's important that we are aware of those trigger events. When they happen, we speak and communicate to communities who might be at risk, and we make people aware that there can be a higher incidence of violence and hate incidents in the immediate wake of these so-called trigger events. So that's something that we can get ahead of, that communication and community cohesion, civil action can actually address. And I think that's something that we see after these trigger events for 2 weeks or a month before they return to so-called normal levels, which is about 2 or 3 hate incidents per day. And I think that when we see these spikes where hate incidents go up to 10 or 12 or even 20 a day in the wake of these events, it's one of the things that I think third-party reporting, making people aware of their rights and their legal obligations, is something that can actually help to depress some of the impacts of those trigger events.